Okay, I am chuckling. The lights are on and we're ready to go. I'm sorry, I'm chuckling. I have a beagle upstairs that I don't know if you guys have beagles, but they smell everything and everything is delicious. And I can tell that she got into something and so she's howling upstairs. She's getting punished. So she just screams about everything. Sorry. Okay, it's AP Gov time. Yay! You know who I am. It's Miss Hitch from TJ up in Alexandria, Virginia, down in Alexandria, Virginia, wherever you are located relative to myself. Today, we are going to continue down our road of looking at federalism from a different, or I'm sorry, looking at the Federalist and anti-Federalist debates from a different perspective, this time hitting up Federalist 51 and Brutus 1. We are going to be taking a look at their positions on ratifying the Constitution, and I would love for you to be able to walk out of here today being able to successfully explain how the Constitution protected against or protected for ordered liberty. So some prereqs, we will be dabbling a little bit on 1.3, looking a little bit into structures, functions of Congress, the presidency, and the judicial branch, because we're going to be talking about checks and balances. So let's get back into our minor factual error to start us off. I had a question from Muthu once again. Hello, my friend. The question about restricting tyranny in 4 acts. Thank you so much for giving me critical feedback. You know, sometimes I want you guys to remember that you know, building this as we fly along. And so sometimes what looks like a graphic organizer that I understand may not make a ton of sense. So I love corrections because it gives me an opportunity to go back and make sure that we're really learning. So yesterday I talked about 2 acts. Act 2 is separated delegated powers to the central government. So I restructured this. So we're looking at just kind of how we took federal economic and defense powers and we separated them out with the legislative branch, the presidency executing, and an independent judiciary, kind of showing that flow of power through elections directly with Congress, and somewhat with the presidency because of the Electoral College, and then the independent judiciary has an indirect selection process. And then 4, let's go back and fix that with our compound republic, which is also known as federalism. We're going to talk about that tomorrow and Thursday. And what we're looking at there is just kind of what powers are delegated, right? So we're looking at those policing powers, things morality, safety, education, health, versus our federal powers of economic and defense. So thank you so much for catching me on that. Bethany had a question about the governor's issue. Right today, we are going through Wisconsin, the presidential primary. Is it okay if states make a determination to delay primaries? And I believe that today they are going ahead in Wisconsin. The answer to you is yes, of course it is. And I know that's crazy to think of. I think for the most part, when we think of elections, we're really just thinking of like the action and less about who that election is for and what is that purpose. So when we think of primaries are any nominating contest. They are intra-party competitions. And it just so happens that in today's expectations of the major parties, we have a preference that it be open to the public through elections or through caucuses, but it's not required at all because it's intra-party. The Constitution says nothing at all about parties. If anything, it's going to carve out a protection for them in the First Amendment. So while it seems crazy that we could cancel primaries, and in some places like here in the state of Virginia, we have things like firehouse primaries where they're done on private property. We have things where they just canvass the party, they do a phone call, they have a convention and they do it, you know, over dinner. However the party determines the best way to be for them to make that decision is perfectly legal. There are some restrictions on it, things like saying that certain classes of people can't participate. For instance, the white primary was a function of the South. It was a function of the Democrats trying to maintain control over Southern politics and to sideline and perpetuate the Jim Crow measures was declared unconstitutional in 1947, I think, off the top of my head. So we do have some intrusions on those things, but they get into like equal protection kind of issues, not whether or not they can whether or not they should be public. Okay, next question. Question from Ethan asks about the argumentation FRQ, whether or not when the prompt that I gave you last class, if you had to talk about how to amend the Constitution. So let's go back to that prompt. That's a great question. And it's going to come back to an acronym that I know is used tons in AP government classes all throughout the country. It's ATQ, answer the question. And here in this situation, it wasn't asked, how would you amend it? The question asked whether or not we should, right? And so you want to make sure that you're really slowing down and processing that question, because in this situation, if you would have gone on and made recommendations as how to best amend the Constitution, that's a completely different question. And unfortunately, when you go off script and you don't spend your time in a response as answering the question that's asked, points can't be given, right? You're part of the whole skill is that you're able to respond to the prompt in a way that shows you flexing through your skills in content acquisition, and answering a different question, even if it's accurate, isn't going to gain you points because it's that skill issue. So let's kind of turn into our warm up today. This was the FRQ that I gave you, and let's see if we can practice some of this content. Now, again, I'm going to continue to move forward because I want to make sure that I'm catching us through, I'm pushing us through this entire presentation. So if you have not read this or you did not get a chance to practice this, you can hit pause at this point, and I'm going to proceed forward, kind of assuming, that you've had time to look at it. All right, so our question here is asking whether or not what we have to develop an argument as to whether horse race coverage has had a positive or negative impact on congressional elections. So yesterday in the description, in the link that takes you to materials that I'm sharing with students, where you've gotten, all kinds of things from me. The resource page had a graphic organizer that was there to help you start stepping through these processes. So this is what I'm hoping you use. And if you didn't print it out, you can, always like shorthand it, but it's a way of just kind of grouping your thought together so that you're stepping through this process in a logical manner. And I had said yesterday that I highly encourage that we outline, that you take the time, because when you're outlining, you're really weighing both sides. And a lot of the skill is a comparison issue. Like you have to take a position on that prompt, you're comparing two different perspectives, so on and so forth. So in order to make sure that we're answering the question, that we're stepping through everything logically, that things connect, we should outline. All right, so we're going to take this and going back to the prompt, we had to give a positive and a negative, right? A positive and a negative on whether or not they help congressional campaigns. Would we want to talk about presidential campaigns here? No, it's not in the prompt, right? So we're going to take a look at the positive. So off the top of my head, I said, okay, well, it's going to help increase interest, right? If you're getting media coverage, that's a good thing. The option 2, which is a negative here, and this is our reasoning that we would put into our thesis statement, is that it decreases the public's understanding of the candidate's platform, because we're not talking about quantitative, we're not talking about qualitative information, we're not talking about what your positions are in various things. We're instead talking about how are you doing in the polls, what's the latest drama, so on and so forth. Also, I think it's worth your time, and even though we're talking about thesis statements here, for you to sit and to think about how you're going to step through, or what supporting evidence you're going to use to build out the rest of that essay. So I took a look at how would I use Federalist 10, how would I use Article 1, and then again, using Article 1, and you can use that prompt, like you can use it either way. Some of these documents, it really depends on the way that you're turning that factual based evidence, right? Turning that fact and how you're viewing it in relation to your thesis statement. So feel free to kind of like really twist and turn that evidence. It's almost kind of helps you think about making logical connections if you're using the same evidence, but you're using it in two different ways, because it really deepens your knowledge of that document. So here, I'm using the same thing that the House and the Senate are tied to the people via elections to give me a positive and a negative, and I'm starting to brainstorm how I might interpret that to support my thesis statement. And then, of course, I'm turning to Amendment 1, the freedom of the press. So I've outlined this, and then the next step is to take that and to make a decision in terms of which position I'm going to walk into in my thesis. Now, again, to reiterate from yesterday, because I like to make sure that we're all on the same page, I don't know where you're picking up and where you're leaving off, that while the new structure doesn't require a D counterpoint, which I'm sure that you guys have been working on throughout the year, you still can present a counterpoint. It's called putting down spare tires, right? It's doing more work than is necessary that isn't going to take you away from the point of the prompt. And giving a counterpoint here, even though it feels like we're not answering the question, it is. I mean, I think it's a better way to roll because it's making sure that you truly understand that prompt. And I'm going to start presenting you some alternative versions of the prompt. I kind of see some patterns in terms of the way that College Board presents questions. So it really helps you kind of pinpoint your focus to make sure that you're accurately answering the question, to make sure that you are logically constructing an argument better. So even though we don't need to have a counterpoint, I am going to counsel my students to continue to use that skill. Also, sometimes it's hard to like unlearn a process and then relearn a different one. So, kind of talk it out with your teacher of record and figure out where they're comfortable. But this is the route that I'm going to take. So here I'm going to present the side that I'm not going to talk about that doesn't have a better, in my mind, or at least a position that I want to present as the best. So I'm going to say the positive impact, horse race journalism has a positive impact because always kind of is a turn signal indicating that you are about to move from your counterpoint lane to the reasoning lane. So it's going to help increase interest in campaigns, full stop. Now I want to restate that prompt and I want to make sure that I'm using clear language that shows that this is my preferred answer. There is a stronger argument that horse race journalism has a negative impact because it decreases the view of the public's, or decreases the public's understanding of each candidate's platform. Now, this in and of itself is not a thesis. This is an outline. So I need to turn this into a free-flowing set of sentences that moves from one point to the next, right? Where I'm clearly taking a position. And again, taking a position is taking a risk because it's not facts. It is my opinion on what is best. I have to weigh out some, idea or two ideas and figure out which one I like better. So here, my thesis statement could be perhaps the impact of horse race journalism could be understood as positive. And I'm already planting that seed of doubt, which is indicating to the reader that I don't really like this idea as much. Now, remember, again, I want to show reasoning. Because is our surefire way of showing reasoning. It's almost like you have to finish that statement. And as soon as you're stepping into because, you're taking a risk because you're spinning whatever the facts might be with your opinion. And in here, the opinion that might logically flow is that the public's interest in campaigns increases. Great, right? However, again, another clear turn signal to the reader that I am countering what I just said. I am disagreeing with that statement because I don't feel as though it's a stronger argument. So horse race journalism, again, using superlatives, is far more negative because the focus on political intrigue and polling results decreases voters' grasp on each candidate's platform. So that is, we're going to work one more time today on playing around with thesis statements. So ready, we'll come back to that after we get through our content. So let's connect back to our previous knowledge. What is supposed to keep our system of ordered liberty functioning? And When we think about this, I mean, like every government wants to be able to say, well, I shouldn't say every government, but our government certainly wants to be able to kind of balance out these two contrary ideas that you as an individual have the liberty to pursue your dreams to the best of your ability in an environment that has order and predictability to it. And those two things are contrary because maybe your whatever it is that you want to do doesn't jive with what the community wants to do. So we kind of have to constantly reassess where we want this balance between liberty and order to be. Now, liberty, the individual's liberty, is threatened when one branch of the government acquires more than one of the powers of the government, and all the more when it acquires all three. So what does this mean? Your ability to be able to pursue your dreams is weighed in American government by separating out our powers, right? We talked about this last class, that we've made this determination that it really is damaging to individual liberty when you put into one person's hands the ability to write laws, the ability to execute laws, and the ability to judge those laws as being good or bad. So we've separated them out so that they are now, they can't, even if you're able to have a majority in this environment, seize the reins of Congress and they write laws that are really abusive towards a minority group, a minoritized community, it would take the concession or the agreement of the executive agency or the executive branch to continue to carry that. It's almost like a fire break, right? We're creating a space where someone can question and say, I don't necessarily know that this is exactly what I want to do. And so they have discretion in how they carry out law. And then, again, because we have an independent judiciary and we have courts that are empowered to make the decision of whether or not an action or a law is constitutional, right? You have a final fail-safe that's embedded in our system that allows courts through informal tradition to judge the constitutionality, to kind of hold a law up against our supreme document, the Constitution, and determine whether or not it's something that it is bad for a minority of some ilk. So we get back to separating powers. This is a really important idea that comes from history. We see it's reiterated quite beautifully in Baron de Montesquieu's writing. All of the founding fathers at the time were reading Montesquieu. They were thinking about this, and we have to remember they also were living in a time period in which they saw the government that they most disliked, that would be Great Britain, did not have separation of powers, and they saw that to be problematic. So if we come up against this idea of why separation of powers is important, it's a first step, right? But if the independent branches don't have self-interest, if you don't animate them in a way that causes them to cast a watchful eye on the others, you are running the risk that one of those branches will, over time or suddenly, just start to kind of Pac-Man eat away at the powers of the other branches. So not only do we have to make them self-interested in their desire to want to watch, but we also have to give them weapons to prevent against those encroachments. And that's where we get at Montesquieu's idea here that it's not just separation of powers, it's also checks and balances. They're critically important. And it is a flaw that was seen in Great Britain. So were we the first? Now, of course, if you're thinking about this, I just kind of answered this question. No, we weren't. So we had checks and balances, but checks and balances theoretically and in practice look very different, right? So if we go back to Rome, we can see that the checks and balances that were in place were dressed up through class issues, the proletariats versus the plebeians, and who had different legislative bodies, and the powers that animated each of those legislative bodies were very different, and they were really distinctive based on class lines. In the several states, if we look around at the 13 colonies walking out of rule under Great Britain, they also had lots of different variations on separation of powers and checks and balances. And a lot of them were more kind of geared towards exercise of power, right? We're enabling you to be able to use this trump card to be able to check an intrusion from whichever branch you want to shake a finger at here. So it's kind of more interesting to think about, where do we not see these checks and balances? And the first place on the stop in the history of checks and balances is we did not see them in Great Britain. The king, during the Glorious Revolution, he's going to abdicate his powers to Parliament, and he is going to rule in tandem. He actually, they renamed the ruling body from the king, who was sovereign, to the Crown and Parliament. And so any decision that had previous to the Glorious Revolution been made was made by the king by himself. I mean, if we think back to the rulers of England, they got so jazzed up with being able to make decisions that King Henry VIII couldn't even decide what religion he wanted to be a part of. Would he want to be a Catholic? Did he want to be Anglican? He went back and forth so many times. And so we really think about that as being just kind of like a really great example of arbitrary use of these powers that are given to the ruler. We call them prerogative powers. So in order to kind of walk out of some bad times prior to the Glorious Revolution, I'm not going to spend too much time in English history, although it's interesting, we just don't have time. We see that the Crown and Parliament will rule together. And this is a big part of why the Revolutionary War happened. It was an issue of a disagreement over who should be the legislative branch. If you go back and you take a look at the complaints that were being made, while they evolve over time in terms of to what extent or how they want to be remedied, much of the complaints had to do with this issue of the colonial legislatures had been the legislative body. They had signed an agreement in contract with the king when each of these colonies was founded. And as soon as the Crown and Parliament starts to walk in and Parliament is making laws, you see the king is violating his own contracts with the colonists, and they start to kind of close down our parliaments. They start to say, we're going to take parliamentary power away from you. And this is the issue, is that we in America, the 13 colonies, the colonies believed that the only thing they shared in common with Parliament was that they had a common sovereign, they had a common king, but they were separate in terms of their legislative authority, in terms of their jurisdiction, so on and so forth. And so this radical restructuring is certainly problematic. And I can't even get into the fact that England did not have independent courts at all. The courts served at the king's behest. So the other issue that we see here is the Articles of Confederation. Articles of Confederation really did not give us these limitations through checks and balances at all. There was no independent executive. It served at the behest of the legislative branch. There was no independent judiciary, again, served at the behest of the legislative branch. It was problematic. And it made it, in addition to the fact that you didn't have enough power to the center, it made it ineffective in dealing with problems that were erupting all over the new 13 independent countries. So we kind of look at this time period as a bunch of broken contracts. We talk so much about the social contract theory and this idea that we are all, giving away the full extent of our natural rights to live in a system of ordered liberty, so that we have predictability, so we can pursue our dreams. And when we don't have either enough liberty or either enough order, we have tyranny. And tyranny, like I said yesterday, can come in all shapes and sizes. It can come from the people, it can come from single rulers, it can come from an oligarchy. But really, the tyranny in Great Britain was not just where power was centered and who was ruling, but it was also in this inability for branches to check the intrusions of power. And there was a lack of representation that created an environment where the foreign legislative body and Parliament could wage almost pseudo-economic war against, first, the wealthy of the New England colonies, with our Stamp Acts going after papers that are necessary for those who own businesses, so on and so forth, all the way down, kind of like moving down the chain to the Sugar Act. And it's also going to expand in geography as it gets out to the Tea Act, these are critical things that all classes are enjoying. And then as the malcontent spreads, as Congress becomes more punitive, Parliament becomes more punitive, this is where we see this kind of this welling up of this idea of we need to have independence. And in all of this, the one thing that did nothing to protect the natural rights of colonists was the English Bill of Rights, written in 1689, right after the Glorious Revolution. It did nothing to protect our colonists' natural rights. It was an empty and a broken promise. And I want you to file that away for a second, because we're going to think about this. So the big fix, our revolution in independence, is here to go towards liberty, right? We're going to have small sovereign states. We're going to have representation for smaller communities with a Montesquieuian state government. We're going to, where we're separating powers and we have checks and balances. We're going to have cooperation only to ensure survival of these new 13 states. And we're going to have a severely limited cooperative body. Now, some people have this really interesting theory, and you almost see the fingerprints of it embedded in the writings of Madison and embedded in the writings of others of our founding fathers, that the Articles of Confederation was really just a treaty, that it was, it was there to be able to make sure that the new sovereign states, the 13 sovereign states, were able to survive in the face of, the incursions in trade by the Spaniards and the French and the English. And in order to be able to provide that they can continue to trade, that they can continue to exist, that they're not, these other foreign powers aren't arming the sovereign territory, the sovereign nations of Native Americans, that we needed to have liberty above all else. And this was the best way to do it. So you construct this article, the Articles of Confederation, and we see that, we start to see this idea of a treaty kind of take place here. And there's disagreement from historians whether or not that's really what it was. But it's an interesting idea because it helps us understand why the articles are so limiting, why it took 100% of the sovereign states to be able to say, yeah, we want to change the Constitution. Which, by the way, when we wrote the Constitution, we didn't even have 100% agreement to change the Articles of Confederation. In fact, North Carolina said no, and Rhode Island just said, we're not even going to bring this up. It wasn't until political pressure was put on those states by their surrounding neighbors before they changed their mind. You see things like we have, you have a legislative person who's there to execute things when the Congress under the Articles is not in session, but they're not really independent. They can't do anything beyond that. There's no ability to coordinate trade. So you still have all of these cascading problems from being able to collect taxes to support the military, to being able to ensure that treaties between the Confederation and other sovereign states are respected. I mean, there's all kinds of crazy stuff that comes out of this. And one of my favorite documents in American history is called Vices by Madison, which is, it's linked here at the bottom of our conversation today, where he runs through 11 reasons prior to going to Annapolis for the convention to kind of call into question the ability of the Articles to do what they're supposed to do. He observes 11 reasons why things are just not good. Things from states ignoring constitutional requirements, right, which are Articles of Confederation. Whether you think it's a treaty, it definitely is a constitution. It's a written system of government. It is our first constitution. The states are encroaching on national governmental authority by saying, we're not going to pay for taxes, we're not going to pay off our debts. There's treaties between the United States of America under the Articles of Confederation and other governments that are completely ignored, that are violated, that are also causing economic chaos because it's creating ports that are less likely to put on punitive taxes on imports and things like this. There's a crazy war that's happening between Connecticut and Pennsylvania in the middle of New York called the Pennamite Yankee Wars. And this is the third round where they're fighting over what would now be Erie, Pennsylvania. I can't imagine the state of Connecticut walking across New York to go kick Pennsylvania's butt, but this is what happened. I mean, not just Shays Rebellion and outright what we would have a really hard time viewing as being a peaceful domestic problem. We would probably have more colorful language that we would use to describe what Shays Rebellion was. That begins with the letter T. States are not capable of repelling internal violence. I mean, Daniel Shays and his rebellion, the governor of Massachusetts asks for assistance, and everyone around him is like, no, we're not going to do that, right? Treaties they cannot enforce a universal adherence to treaties. States are contradicting each other, and state laws are just flat out unjust. So this is a failure. And when we come into the Constitutional Convention, what we see here is that it's going to take more power to the center. We talked about that for sure last class. But in addition to that, we need to start separating out those powers and then making them self-interested, right? And so we see over time, not only do we have formal checks and balances, but we also have informal checks and balances that have grown out of party action, that have grown out of congressional, presidential, judicial action, that help us understand how our branches are not only retaining the powers that have been delegated to them by the people, but preventing intrusion from other branches. And it's this structure, again, we come back to Brutus, where Brutus is really alarmed. It's a radically different government. We are not using what England would use with the parliamentary system. Now, of course, like, did the states, parliamentary means like they are electing the prime minister from the body of the representatives, as opposed to allowing the people to make that determination on their own. That was a way to create another separation of power, was to create the presidential system, in which, although we have this, like, we do have the electoral college, it's creating a completely different wellspring of authority for the president, not making it reliant on the legislature at all. So Brutus comes back and he, like, hey guys, like, let's slow this down. We have to remember that really at this time period during the Constitutional Convention, there's not many what we would call anti-federalists there. The largest contingency of anti-federalists would be from the state of New York. Governor Clinton sent a bunch of them down, and Hamilton is like the least of all in terms of an anti-federalist. And so it kind of caught them flat-footed. They weren't able to keep up with this. And so kind of part of this whole thing is to slow down this conversation. And so there's a lot of fear-mongering going on here that we're going to, we should have stuck to an improved Confederacy. They didn't have authority to completely change the Articles of Confederation. They were doing something here that was not congruent with the problem. We should have just given more powers like we saw under the New Jersey plan and called it a day. All right, now Brutus, again, he's going back to, hey, like, we should have smaller states. Smaller states are better in terms of representation. You have elected officials who are better able to be accountable for their behaviors to their voters. The larger that group, or the larger the voters, the larger the constituents, the less likely you're able to find representation for those issues. And on top of that, you're giving these expansive national powers that, in the hands of a very distant government, can really destroy localities. So we're talking about the pervasive power to tax, to coordinate national trade policies. And again, if you're thinking about this as a treaty, it comes back to that idea of, do you really want, a government to be able to control your community's economic interests? The ability to fund a national army comes into this. You have a single strong executive, and a single strong executive, there's actually a day in the Constitutional Convention in which Hamilton, it's one of my favorite days, it's in July of 1787, and he has this like full-on day where he just says, well, let's just have a king. I mean, it was better when we had a king. Let's just go back to having this system of government. Madison's notes are kind of funny because he's like, okay, whatever, like, no. That'll come back when we talk about Federalist 70, so don't forget that one. And then we have an erosion of our ability to represent our communities effectively. And he will go on to say that our 13 sovereign states as we know them will cease to exist, that you will have a court that is animated through the powers. He points out the necessary and proper clause, the last section of the section 8, article 1, which is our necessary and proper clause, which is, it expands the powers of the federal government so long as they are born in the enumerated powers in Article 8. The federal government can stretch those powers to take on larger problems. And then he also talks about the 6th article, which is the supremacy clause, right? It appears that when you look at these things together, you're animating a government that is poised to strike when emergencies come and to take away the community's ability to self-govern, which is really his concern, right? And he does not want this pluralist system that Madison talks about in Federalist 10. He wants participatory. He wants to be able for us to go and speak truth to those who are in power, to be able to take care of ourselves better than you would see in a pluralist thing. And if we think a little bit about this too, like, it's so weird for us to think about America in 1787. I want you to think about it as, I don't know, Europe, right? I mean, what do New Englanders, New England doesn't even really exist. What do people from Rhode Island have in common with people from Georgia, have in common with people from Pennsylvania? And the answer is very little. They're culturally so different. And he's so concerned that that culture is not only from religion, it's not only from, their economy, it's not only from how they were founded, but it also has in large part to do with the environment in which those things live. And by giving so much power to the center, you're creating an environment where you will lose control of being able to make determinations about agricultural policy or commercial policy, or creating ships or pine tar pitch or whatever it might be, because in this time period, geography and climate is just as much, according to political philosophers like Montesquieu, to do with who we are as a person as anything else. So if we go back, Brutus and Madison, interestingly enough, are not really debating the same thing. Brutus is talking about, we should fear this large compound republic, and we should have limited government. And Madison is looking at this in terms of, well, no, we're better off having competition of these ideas. And he's going to circle it back around to come into, it's not just that, also, it's that we are creating a system where we're diluting the majority in these increasingly larger bodies of representation, but we're also forcing them to compete. So it's like this marketplace of competition where ideas are able to perpetuate, and ambition of one branch keeps the ambition of another. So yesterday somebody asked me a question like, can we use direct quotes? And I will tell you that ambition must be made to counteract ambition is such a well-known quote out of Federalist 51. So if you were to use something like that, I don't think that I would bat an eye. However, if you were to use this entire passage, I definitely would, especially if it was spot on. So try to paraphrase this, right? This idea, which is what I'm doing right now. I'm not reading this verbatim, because you can pause this and read this at any point in time. What I'm doing is I'm summarizing Madison's belief that the best way to keep people in check, the best way to keep these governments in check, is by forcing them, is by using human condition and human desire for self-interest, the same thing we talked about in Federalist 10 with factions, and making them compete, right? Give them weapons so that they can prevent these intrusions. So he's going to create these firewalls, and these firewalls with these checks and balances, they're better than anything that a Bill of Rights could produce. If only we would have had separation of powers, if only we would have had unforced competition between Parliament and the king and an independent judiciary, perchance we would not have even needed to, have a revolutionary war. Now, I'm just editorializing there, like no one to my knowledge has ever said that. But it is an interesting question, because we're getting at here, if you're competing, right, and if you're protecting liberty, you don't need to worry about having to write out all of the things that a government can't do, because you'll be able to influence those different branches for your own interest, right? Because they have different sources of authority, they have different ways of indicating preferences, and through that system of having, the people, the 30,000 people that was originally supposed to be represented by each member in the House, and the Senate having the entire state's population, and the president having the electoral college, the elites of the country, that gives you different perspectives, different flares, different flavors coming in through Congress, and they're all competing. So separation of power, it's not enough. He goes on to make this very strong argument that you need to have a competition, like I said, and then he's going to go on and on and on and on and on about how incredibly important this is, because he's going to say it's not just that, but it's also a separation of powers between small and large republics. And that's where he's opening the door for us to understand the Bill of Rights, or the lack of Bill of Rights, because he says federalism is a huge component to this as well. So, again, I would spend some time looking at this. It's really, he has some really fantastic quotes here that I wish I could have a little bit more time to look at here, but it's really a fascinating combination of thinking about kind of the human condition and our own interests and our desire to compete over limited resources, and just trying to create a system where we're constantly at odds with each other. And it's intentional. It creates time, it creates space for conversations, it requires us to have long, lengthy conversations, which is like one of the most interesting things, and one of the most interesting questions that maybe comes out of this is, what was Madison really looking for us to do to be able to keep us from being tyrannical? And that is time to talk, time to have conversations, time to deliberate, time to compete, to hear different perspectives, and to have to weigh those values, which is interesting because that's in short order these days. Our understanding of what these checks and balances mean evolves over time, obviously, and it makes it more or less effective. So as we go through this, we talked a little bit about kind of changing the Constitution informally, and I really love this graphic. We're going to talk about this in 2 classes because it helps us see the differing perspectives on how we read the Constitution. And we'll come back around to this as we get going, but I want to make sure that we have some time for guided practice. So here we are again. Here is our prompt. Pause, read the prompt, try to figure out what's being asked, and then we're going to practice. All right, I'm moving ahead. All right, so again, we're looking for that defensible thesis point, which is going to provide a counterpoint reasoning, a position, and explaining how or why, right? Don't put contextualizing information in it. Don't put a background. Don't do any of that. Just give me that first paragraph. Let's move on. So our prompt here is asking us whether or not, let's go back to it really quickly, whether or not checks and balances are enough on their own to curb abuses of majority. So this is something that we have just spent the entire class talking about, right? So I come up with not enough versus effectively. Now, we'll come back in a couple classes to take a look at my evidence and commentary, but that's not the skill that we're working on here. So once I've spelled them all out, what I want to do is I really just want to focus on that top bar, right across the top where I'm looking at position and reasoning. So I can kick that out into a defensible thesis, so I can get that point. All right, so one of the things that I want to, as an observation here, is that it's asking me to present arguments in a manner that feels a lot like point counterpoint. It's either it is good or it isn't good. Sometimes they ask you to weigh different options, and we're going to talk about that next class. So make sure that when you're reading this, that you're reading the prompt closely to see exactly what kind of thinking skill they want you to do. We're going to talk about that next class. I'm going to show you the different examples of how they're structured. So here's our, today it is point counterpoint. It's either it's good or it's bad, right? It's effective or it's not. And so it's a pretty easy, straightforward prompt. Here we can just go in and say, counterpoint, effectively allow for curbing of abuses because provide standards for conduct that are deeply rooted in American culture. However, checks and balances aren't enough because it can be ignored. So we want to turn this into a thesis statement, a free-flowing idea here in 2 sentences. I like starting, again, if we're looking for something that can be a crutch in this really quick timed writing that is not supposed to be a perfect example of an essay, we might want to say some may argue that checks and balances effectively curb, blah, 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 blah. You can read it, right? Because I just said that. Full stop. However, again, turn signal. I'm turning from a counterpoint into a point lane, right? Current events indicate differently that checks and balances fail to curb abuses of modern political parties. There we go. We're seeing that I'm repeating the prompt because, and again, because is a great term that we use as a turn signal, that I'm moving from my position, right? That I'm moving from my opinion into some reasoning that I will illuminate later in my essay. So because is fantastic, it's forcing you to show how or why. And here we're saying because modern partisan structures can enable partisan majorities to ignore charges. All right. Let's check for understanding. How did we do today on checks and balances? So we've got our first question: constitutional checks and balances, especially applied to the president, are designed to, so we would have to know in particular all of our things that the president can or cannot do, right? A, provide for a balanced budget. B, minimize threat of tyranny. C, ensure states don't become too powerful. D, ensure efficient government. Did you get it? There's only really like one good distractor, which is C, but it's not going to be C because that's like the entire federal system, right? State versus national. So like the best answer here is really just B, right? We don't want tyranny. Tyranny is like the word of the day. Question 2, one example of constitutional checks and balances. Again, you need to know the different kinds of checks and balances. Remember that graph that I had up? I would find a way to take a screenshot of it and point it out somewhere because it's a really helpful way of us understanding how they are preventing an intrusion. A, president declares war. B, but Congress appropriates military funds. B, president nominates cabinet members, but the House holds confirmation hearings. C, House can impeach federal judges, Senate holds impeachment trial. Or D, Congress can override US Supreme Court decisions with constitutionality of law. There's a great distractor on here that I think that even when I like read this the first time, I always have to go back and make sure, because this is really like, these are detail oriented questions. I thought that the great distractor was A, but it's not A because the president doesn't declare war. Congress does. He is commander in chief. He sends folks off to go fight, but he is not declaring war. Okay, so we made it another day. We're done, right? Did we get through Federalist 51 and Brutus? Did we explain the Federalist and Anti-Federalist position? All right, a Federalist wanted to pass the Constitution, Anti-Federalist didn't. We talked about why. It's protection of ordered liberty against tyranny of the majority, so on and so forth. And can you do a better job at explaining that process? So tonight, for your out of class assignment, we're going to go back to 1.2, the ideas of the models of representative democracy, with whether it be participatory, pluralist, or elitist, and if it achieves the founder's intent for American democracy. So I will give you a little bit of a fair warning. This is, remember how I told you that sometimes it's point counterpoint, but it can also be a different structure, right? Where you're either arguing the pros of one position or the cons of another position. This isn't like that. So slow down when you're going through this, right? You're not saying one is good, one is bad, but you actually have to weigh these options against each other. We're going to talk a little bit more about that next class because it is a slightly different logical set of reasoning, but I want to see how you do. I'm going to throw this at you. I'm going to see how you are able to tackle it. And of course, we want to make sure you have device and internet access, cb.org/tech. Help out your friends if you know somebody is in dire need of assistance. Please make sure that you're social distancing and that you're doing things for you and you're taking a break from learning and you're checking in with your emotions and seeing how we're doing in this time, this great trial that's in front of us, whether it be illness or economic issues that are going on at home. Just take time out for you. You're more than a test. Always, always, always. Here are my resources. is, and I'm going to bid you adios, my friends. Have a fantastic night. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye.